Colorado Business Roundtable presents the first annual Collaboration in Industry Awards, featuring great speakers and Colorado's best collaborators in business. With a business roundtable update from Jacque Hinman, CEO of CH2M.
We're going to have a chance to start off today with some remarks from Jacque Hinman. Jacque is one of our headquartered business roundtable CEOs that are here from CH2M. It's a hard day today because Jacque's last day with CH2M is next week. And so we've got a chance to hear from Jacque. Jacque flew back last night from the business roundtable and is going to do a BRT update on trade and tax reform, legislative priorities, and share that. But please join me beforehand in thanking her for her service, not only to CH2M and the employees, but certainly the Colorado landscape. So. The Colorado Business Roundtable is the state affiliate here of the National Business Roundtable. We're the premier policy organization in the country led by CEOs of America's largest companies. The roundtable focuses on policy areas that have direct impact to your business, the ability to be successful, to grow your companies, to hire more employees, and most importantly, to compete in this global economy. Jacque Hinman, as I mentioned, is one of our headquartered BRT companies. She's going to share some updates, so please join me in welcoming to the stage Jacque Hinman.
Safety moment. Okay. Hi, everybody. How are you today? So that was a little bit, thanks, Jeff, for that. There's a reason that my last day is next week. It's kind of an odd way to say it. So many of you know CH2M, proudly headquartered here, majority employee owned. $5 billion of revenue around the world as a large engineering construction company, 20,000 employees, and 20,000 employee shareholders. With a minority investor in Apollo, the private equity company. We are the second largest majority employee-owned company in the world. And that has been a fantastic run for us, but we were reaching the edge of our ownership model, as many employee-owned companies do, whereby at some point in time the majority owners want to cash out. I don't know about you, my kids don't even want to own cars, let alone own a company, and so we had a generational change out that was, of course, occurring. So the reason my last day is next week is that we had great options in terms of either merging with a like-minded public company that could then trade the shares out, or doing an IPO. For those of you that watch the IPO markets, that always gets one a little nervous these days when you're playing with retired shareholder money and you want to make sure you get the right value, but also get the right long-term solution. So we have our proxy meeting next week, but I fully expect that our shareholders will approve our pending merger with Jacobs Engineering, which is a larger public engineering company. And although I offered to their CEO that he could step down and I would run the company, not surprisingly, he thought maybe he should. So with that, it's a bittersweet 30 years, having joined CH2M 30 years ago. I am, as I tell people, I'm not done yet, so I will be looking for some other opportunity, but I know CH2M will be in good hands. So that's, since Jeff said that, I just wanted to make sure everybody understood what was going on. So I also have been a member of the National Business Roundtable, which is about sort of 200 companies that represent the Fortune 300 or so. So it's really the big companies, big American companies, and also have served on the board of directors of that organization. And it's really business focused, as Jeff said. Really, when you go to Washington and these folks meet, it's really about what are the right policies, legislative ideas, et cetera, to advance American business. And so what I'm going to tell you, since I just got back from the meeting, is what I heard yesterday. The primary is, or where are we on the tax bill? What's the legislative agenda for 2018? By the way, they only seem to talk in quarters in Washington because there's midterm elections, and so everybody thinks they're going to not get anything done after the first quarter, as well as trade. So I'll try to make this pretty quickly. So from the tax bill perspective, we heard from Gary Cohn, who's the director of the National Economic Council, and Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, who's on the Senate Committee on Finance. And again, just regardless of what anyone's personal opinions are, this is really business focused, so there's not a lot of discussion around individuals, individual taxes, et cetera, to put that as a lens. So as you well know, the tax bill's now in reconciliation. Both of them indicated they think there were, I mean, there's going to be a lot of little puts and takes, right, in terms of however this sausage making happens in Washington, but they think there's 4 main issues that they're going to have to resolve. I think from perspective of Washington, both the House and the Senate bills are kind of close enough that they expect that they will get something passed. But the 4 main issues they have to resolve sort of in negotiation between the House and the Senate are interest deductibility, the alternative minimum tax, and by the way, they understand that the way it's now sort of structured and what happened in the Senate bill, it's a little bit odd with the 20% rate of whether companies would have to use that versus use the other tax reductions. So they will either somehow get rid of the AMT or lower it to something like 10 to 12%, so it'll be obvious which way a company would go in terms of what it uses for its tax basis. The pass-throughs, right, for the individual status corporations, and they're going to strive for parity with corporate, so there's no negativity about being a pass-through corporation versus a big company. And of course, the state and local taxes, as far as what gets in what version of the bill and what the deductibility is, et cetera. They did indicate that in order to have some level of parity and kind of keep moving through the pass-throughs and the state and local taxes, which affect more individuals necessarily than they do in terms of the large corporations, they are considering, and there's been discussion between the Senate and the House, lowering the top personal rate a little bit, so that therefore there is some parity between the deductibility of state and local taxes and pass-throughs for those individuals that would be in higher individual tax rates, but they would take the hit there. Now, how do they pay for it? How do they pay for all of it? And not surprisingly, it's pretty likely that the corporate tax rate that has been proposed, which has been proposed at 20%, will probably go to 22%. You've already seen that in there. They say 2% will pay for all the things that they want to do, obviously still lower than the current corporate tax rate. The challenge, of course, is I think some headline issues. One is that the president headlined at 20%, so they're trying to keep the headline issues, and then that the OECD global average on corporate tax rate is 22%. And so they were trying to, have a headline for doing business in America that we're actually lower than the OECD average, invest in America both internally from American companies as well as international companies, and that's going to be, they'll determine what they want to do from a PR perspective. But it appears to be that if they go from 20 to 22%, that 2% would theoretically pay for all of the other things they're trying to do. Now, here's one other thing on that, and the question would be, well, why don't they try something else? There really probably is nowhere else to go to get any of the money, depending on what they're negotiating. And for those that aren't tax junkies, it's because of the Byrd budget rule that the Senate is bound by, but not the House, which is that you can't significantly increase the deficit beyond a 10-year term. And so from the 10-year perspective, they had to go somewhere in order to be able to get the money in there. That is, by the way, in a perverse reasoning, why the individual rates actually expire in 10 years, right? It's the Byrd rule that's doing that. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't make sense. Why don't the corporate rates expire in 10 years, right? I think, as you know, the corporate tax rates are essentially permanent until a new administration or somebody comes in and repeals them, but from that perspective, there's no expiration of corporate tax rates. And the reason that happened is from the large corporations that make up enough of the income on corporates, 10 years is not a long enough window to decide that they're going to invest, manufacturing plants, et cetera. So there was a fair amount of pressure from corporations to say, we're not going to build a new car plant, which will take us 5 to 8 years to do if the tax rates are going to expire in 10 years, so you got to make them permanent. So for whatever anybody's political feeling is, that's the reason that came out that way. They do believe they will get a tax bill by the end of the year. That might look like the 31st of December, not before Christmas, but they're working it and they'll see. Now, what does this do to companies? And the one thing, again, many companies in this room may not be affected, but for anybody that particularly is a public company, this is just the beginning. because first thing, Treasury and the IRS has a wide leeway to interpret the bill. Right? There's no instructions in the bill on how Treasury and the IRS interpret reporting, what you expense when, et cetera. So that's a lot that has to be worked with. And then the other issue is that for public companies, assuming this passes before the end of the year, corporate reporting requirements on things like deferred assets and liabilities and the transition tax have to be recorded immediately. And so that would actually have to happen within, probably by the end of the year. They'd have to do 8Ks for public companies and get them out there. So they're working with the Securities and Exchange Commission to say, could we give people a little bit of a grace period, which will probably be no more than a quarter to figure out, based on the day that the tax bill is, what actually your liabilities are and what you have to record. So for those public companies, that's going on. There was a BRT discussion that ensued because, look, the average citizen's going to ask, what did you do with the money? Because corporations, big fat cat companies, will appear to be getting a windfall. And so I think there's going to be a question about a lot more comms around job growth. Probably for any companies, this would be a good thing. Job growth, wages, investment in people, investment in more jobs. And I think particularly for corporate America, if the money's used for share buybacks, that's going to be a pretty ugly, kind of reality from the individual perspective. They did note, both the senator and Gary Cohn noted that based on their estimation, with the changes to the standard deduction and the child care tax credit, 84% of American individual taxpayers will go to one-page returns under this tax bill. I don't know if that's right or not. That's just what they indicated, so for whatever it's worth. So that's what I know on taxes, just reporting it to you. What's next up in 2018? And again, they're sort of talking about first quarter, because they say once they're getting into second quarter, there's midterm elections and everyone in Washington goes brain dead, so that's fine. So the first quarter, there's three things that they think will happen. Most importantly, we don't have a budget. We don't have a federal budget, right? So there needs to be a continuing resolution. They are hoping they will do that at the end of 2017 for 6 weeks so that they can come back after Christmas and then really pass a budget. If that doesn't happen, only in Washington, they will do it for 2 weeks at a time to fund the government for 2 weeks at a time for whatever reason. And so what will likely happen around the budget, because there's going to be some wrestling in the budget provision, sounds like this has sort of already been loosely agreed. In order to get the budget and to make sure they've got adequate military funding, there will be the DACA provision included in the budget, Dreamers, for the Democrats. So that they think that will be tied in order to get both sides to agree on it. Okay, the other thing that will be up in first quarter, they're going to do work on entitlements, mostly Medicaid. Nobody talked about what work they would be doing. That's a separate issue, but they would be doing some work on Medicaid. And then they have talked about an infrastructure bill. Since I was the chair of the BRT's infrastructure committee, I've actually spent a lot of time in the White House and on the Hill and on this issue. This is going to be a slow train. This isn't going to be a fast train. And we think it will probably be mostly regulatory reform. There isn't money anywhere to go fund giant infrastructure packages. In most cases, Jim would know better than I, but polling in general indicates that the public is willing to pay for infrastructure. We saw that here right in our own state. And so there's not a feeling that there needs to be a lot of federal money put toward national or state or local infrastructure, but it would be more about regulatory reform, faster permitting to get projects going faster, and likely there will be a 7-cent gas tax increase for the funding of federal highway and some better road improvements. So there is no ability, by the way, to do reconciliation on that. So this is going to have to be a bipartisan bill, but by and large, between Democrats and Republicans, infrastructure generally polls well, so that we think that there will be something. Who knows if that'll be in the first quarter, but that's something that they want to pass. So that's what I know about 2018 so far. Let me finish with trade, since I'm standing between you and food, or you're already having food. And so just so that we're clear, the Business Roundtable is highly pro-trade, right? Global companies, people that work all over the world. Business Roundtable does not the companies that support the Business Roundtable do not generally go in any way of an American protectionist view. All right, so it's really a global view on this. But from what we were told from both having talked with the trade rep, as well as the administration, as well as Gary Cohn and others. So let's talk about China first. So the administration's first priority, obviously, is more about putting pressure on North Korea than on trade, right? They believe that President Xi is helping a bit more with that, but unclear where that's going to go. The administration is clearly concerned, as we have heard over and over, about the trade imbalance with China, as well as about intellectual property. And of course, businesses are very concerned about that because there's a lot of question about whether your intellectual property gets to stay your intellectual property if you do business in China. We think that probably there won't be much to be able to deal with really on the trade imbalance, other than maybe certain markets like steel and aluminum. And that's simply because, obviously, China is a managed economy and we're a market economy. So I don't think there's going to be a giant aha moment on China and trade. But what they're looking for is maybe some individual markets, some protection of American intellectual property, and then some hope that if everybody doesn't scream at each other, that President Xi will continue to try to exert some pressure, whatever he could, on North Korea. Let's talk about NAFTA. A little bit closer to home for us in Colorado. The next big sit-down in terms of NAFTA negotiations is in January. There are some talks that will happen in December, but nothing of substance. That becomes a little bit of a problem. I think for those that are following Mexico, their elections are in July. And so the last time likely that Mexico could actually agree to something is really in January, February, or else they're going to get into their election cycle. And that probably is a non-starter until they get through their presidential elections. I would say that the Business Roundtable National believes that the latest provisions that have been proposed by the administration are pretty difficult for American companies. For example, the U.S. Put forward a dispute settlement. So in other words, if there were disputes in the future around NAFTA, that actually recognizes U.S. sovereignty first, which would essentially say that although NAFTA is between three companies, basically the U.S. gets to weigh in first every time, and so that's probably not that really popular with Canada and Mexico right now, as you might imagine. There are things, for example, based on industries that what the U.S. put forward was that, for example, for automobiles, 50% of all parts in an automobile must be produced in the U.S. or they can't be protected by NAFTA. I think most people know that most cars manufactured in the U.S. don't have 50% content because they might get parts from Asia or elsewhere, so that would actually have to require U.S. manufacturing to completely change in order to make it be 50% content, so that's going to be an issue, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of, depending on what industry people are in, issues, and then Canada's got some other issues, et cetera. The money is on, the odds-on favorite is that it will probably wait. Any movement on NAFTA would probably wait until the Mexican presidential election is taken care of in the summer, and then a revisit to NAFTA maybe in the fall. I would say that, again, the National Business Roundtable companies think that's probably a good idea because at least they know NAFTA won't be repealed for the next 6 months. So stay tuned on that. And then the last thing, COBRT, the South Korean deal. Threat of withdrawal by the U.S. is actually frustrating the South Koreans, not surprising. The undertones of North Korea issues are making it more challenged, and it's generally in stalemate, but again, it doesn't look like that COBRT is going to be repealed. We think there'll just be a lot of kind of talk for the next 6 months, and then something may happen. So anyway, best I know from reporting to you from the Business Roundtable, hope that was helpful. Thank you.